Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's event. I'm Gabriel Smith. Today's event is out of the Housing Opportunities Expansion and Homeless Prevention LCG. And our topic for today is preventing homelessness, exploring strategies to reach those at greatest risk. All right, land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life. And some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. On this slide, we have some resources that you can use. They will be in the chat, and you can use this so that way you can find out whose lands you currently inhabit. I would do one for myself. I currently live in Atlanta, Georgia. So I currently live on lands that were once inhabited by the Creek Native American people. The promise of community action. Community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. The Practice Transformation team is our Senior Vice President, Tiffany Marley, our Director, Lily Steels, our Program Associates, Laura Griffin and Amy Roberge, and then myself, I'm the Senior Associate for Learning and Dissemination. Our agenda for today, we have a welcome, and then we will hear research, current in the field research on preventing homelessness from our amazing panel. And then we'll also have an opportunity to ask them some questions in a Q&A session, and then we will close out for the day. So the Learning Communities Resource Center is the innovation hub for the ever-changing complex issues that revolve around poverty. The learning community is designed to share innovative approaches and assess proven strategies to move families and communities forward. The LCRC is funded by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families, Office of Community Services, and one of our learning community groups is the Housing Expansion Opportunities and Homeless Prevention. Housing is often the biggest expense for families. Affordable housing remains elusive. And with this already pervasive issue, we add a pandemic that further burdens families who may have already been underemployed. So we will first hear from Dr. Sharon McDonald. Dr. Sharon McDonald is a senior fellow for families and children at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, where she's worked for over 20 years. Dr. McDonald has been a licensed clinical social worker since 1991 and holds a PhD in social work and social policy from Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. So I will hand it over to Dr. Sharon McDonald, who will then introduce our other speakers and our amazing panel, starting with Peggy Bailey.
Policy advisor for the Corporation for Supportive Housing and served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Special Needs, overseeing HUD's multi-billion-dollar homelessness and HIV/AIDS housing portfolio. Mary Beth Shin is a Cornelius Vanderbilt professor at Vanderbilt University who studies how to prevent and end homelessness. Her 2020 book with Jill Kaduri, In the Midst of Plenty, Homelessness and What to Do About It, surveys all of the research on what we know on how to end homelessness, and her chapter on prevention in that book should be required reading if you're handling a lot of money to prevent homelessness. And we will hear from Janie Roundtree, who is the founding executive director of the California Policy Lab at UCLA. In addition to leading the Policy Lab, she's a member of the Alliances, as is Beth, Research Council, and she's the Deputy Director of the Homeless Policy Research Institute. She's doing a lot of innovative work with administrative data, which she's going to share with us today. So I'm really excited that that we all get the opportunity to learn from these wonderful and awesome women. And with that, I will turn that over to my friend, Peggy Bailey.
Thanks, Sharon, and good afternoon, everyone. It is great to be with you today. I want to start by thanking all of you for the great work you do every day to help people experiencing homelessness and those who need help the most. I can't imagine what the last year and a half has been like for all of you, not only with the difficulty of work, but also the personal challenges and trying to address that the rest of us have had to deal with during the pandemic. So I just want to applaud you for all of your work. As Sharon said, I'm the senior advisor on rental assistance, which means that I work on the policy decisions related to the voucher program, public housing, and our multifamily housing portfolio. My time is also focused on working with the Department of Treasury to help implement the emergency rental assistance program. And we've been lifting up HUD's efforts on eviction prevention and intervention as we and working as partners with the Centers for Disease Control as they oversee their eviction moratorium. The priorities for HUD, as laid out by Secretary Fudge, are centered around the people we serve and focusing on those who need help the most. So it's completely aligned with all of the work that you do. And her charge to us is that whatever we do, we think about the people who are going to be using HUD assistance. Are we doing the most and the best that we can for them? Front of mind for us and for all of you is how quickly and smartly we can administer the unprecedented amount of resources that Congress has made available to HUD and our partner agencies, primarily at Treasury and USDA, through the pandemic relief programs contained in the CARES Act from 2020, the FY 2021 appropriations bills, and the American Relief Plan that was passed earlier this year. And we'll go into more detail about those resources. But an often overlooked aspect of the relief initiative is the flexibility that Congress gave HUD to administer those programs, and that HUD and the programs administered through Treasury and USDA, passing on that flexibility to communities. Now, this flexibility means that there's extra pressure on the states and localities to align resources and create accountability measures, but the opportunity to create systems out of silos is what I hope for all of you very exciting. And not only are there the resources through the variety of HUD programs that are out there and Treasury and USDA, which can't be forgotten, but there are resources like the $350 billion within the state and local relief fund, which has maximum flexibility and can be used to fill the gaps left by other programs. And which is particularly important, which all of you know, when we're trying to serve people with the largest needs, being able to pay for the case management services and pay at better rates than we've gotten in the past, for example, is a critical component of making sure that people with the greatest needs get the housing and the services that they need. And what all of you see is how the systems or the silos should be better connected and could really bring valuable experience to the grantees at the local level and city administrators on where you see the gaps are for your clients, so that these resources don't stay in the silos, but really do create the systems that people need and a continuum of housing and supports that that people need to stay housed. In addition to dealing with the crisis at hand and maximizing these new resources, the other priorities that are just important for you to understand from the Secretary are increasing access to home ownership, especially for communities of color. We've done work to improve how student loan debt is considered in mortgage practices, and looking at ways to increase down payment assistance. We also understand that there's a long-term need to increase the supply of affordable housing, and these proposals are primarily in the American Jobs Plan proposal. And a critical component for serving those who need it the most are the HUD programs that come to the table. The low-income housing tax credit is great and does good work in bringing down rental housing costs, but it doesn't do it enough for our folks. And so programs like home, project-based rental assistance, and the Housing Trust Fund are all needed as a part of the jobs package to make sure we have deeply affordable housing for people that are experiencing homelessness. We also have a priority to increase access to housing vouchers. A down payment on this is the 200,000 vouchers that were included in the president's FY22 budget proposal, but we know that we need to go further, and the president has the goal of creating a universal voucher program that all people who are eligible can have access to. And then, of course, continuing our march toward ending homelessness. It would be a shame if all of the resources that have been distributed to us by Congress only address the crisis at hand. And in the next 2, 3, 4 years, once these resources are expended, we're back in the same place we were prior to the pandemic. We should all make sure that that's not an acceptable outcome, that we should address the current crisis to create in a way that creates long-term benefits. And I know other speakers will be speaking more directly to that point. Integral to all of this work is the President and Secretary Fudge's commitment to correcting housing policies that have perpetuated systemic racism and discrimination. This includes helping communities invest in communities of color, strengthening oversight of the Fair Housing Act, and reviewing programs that have a history of paternalistic practices that perpetuate negative stereotypes and create barriers for families to achieving their goals. HUD has a huge role to play in, for example, HUD has a huge role to play in helping renters build savings and assets that may help them achieve long-term goals, such as sending children to college or buying a home. These are things that could be built better into rental assistance programs from the beginning, and is something that we're considering. The most important thing that we can do right now is to recognize that negative outcomes like evictions and homelessness were a crisis prior to the pandemic. And so, as I said before, and often happened in the shadows, but had devastating effects for families. And so I really give all of us the charge to make sure that we're using this unprecedented amount of resources to make sure that we're correcting for those past mistakes, not simply the crisis at hand. So to wrap up so that you can get to the panel as quickly as possible, I just want to say again that we at HUD appreciate all of the work that you're doing to help families with the lowest incomes and helping us achieve our goals of ending homelessness. I hope that you're excited about the billions of dollars that are streaming into your communities. And I ask you to work with us and let us know what's working at the local level, what's not, and seek out and let us help also in making sure that this flexibility that cities and states have are used to maximum effect in getting resources in the hands of the people who need it the most. So Sharon, I will pass it back to you.
Thank you, Peggy. I think I speak for everyone when I say how grateful we are to have you at the helm. So we really do appreciate that. And now to turn it over to my friend Annaleva.
Great. Thank you so much, Sharon, and to the Community Action Partnership. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today to talk about this, because this is such a timely topic. And targeting federal funds to prevent homelessness is such an important, as Peggy sort of laid out, is such an important thing to be thinking about right now as folks are planning the use of all of these funds that have been allocated over the last year. We really want to dig in today on how to maximize these funds and serve people who need it the most. So if you could go to the next slide, please. As Peggy mentioned, there are a number of funding streams that have been allocated for COVID response over the last year, and that can be used to conduct various types of prevention, which I'll talk about. So what I'm going to do today is really just set the stage from an intervention and from a funding standpoint, and the other panelists we'll dive much more deeply into what effective prevention looks like. So specifically today, I'm going to be talking about funds that are made available through the CARES Act, like the Emergency Solutions Grants CV program, the Community Development Block Grant CV program, and the Coronavirus Relief Funds. In addition to those, there were funds appropriated in December of 2020. Those were emergency rental assistance funds on this chart. They're emergency rental assistance 1. And then we also had the package that was most recently passed, the American Rescue Plan, that included additional emergency rental assistance funding, which is referenced on this chart as ERA 2. In addition to emergency housing vouchers and home funds that are really targeted to homelessness assistance. So the purpose of this chart is really to show you that there are a number of different resources that are available through all of these mechanisms that have passed over the last little bit more than a year that are important for you all to think about. And Peggy laid out, there are some like the Coronavirus Relief Funds or the American Rescue Plan, state and local government aid that are incredibly flexible and that really can be used to fill in the gaps where you need additional resources. And all of these other programs have different kinds of rules and regulations that go along with them and some limitations. So really thinking about this in the most comprehensive way is probably the best way to go from the community standpoint. And here you can see all of those different funding sources on the left and what they can pay for. Usually prevention interventions have 3 main components. There's rental and utility assistance. So how can you pay rent, arrears, as well as utilities and utility arrears for households who are eligible? Then there's a services component for folks who need and want those types of services, anything from case management to more intensive types of services. And then there's usually another financial assistance component that could be things like moving assistance or first month's rent and security deposit or other types of financial assistance that don't fit squarely into rental and utility assistance. And you can see here that I've highlighted 4 programs in particular that I just want to take one little deeper dive into before I pass it off to my co-panelists. If you go to the next slide. So these 4 programs really make up the bulk of the housing specific response to the crisis. So first, you have your emergency rental assistance dollars. That is, as I mentioned, it was passed in 2 different sort of tranches. It's nearly $50 billion and has those 2 tranches have different expenditure dates, but it's really focused on households that are at or below 80% of the area median income, have experienced hardship due to COVID-19, and who are at risk of homelessness or housing instability. Next, through the CARES Act, $4 billion was passed in the Emergency Solutions Grants Program. That has an expenditure date of 2022, the end of September 2022, and that is really focused on people who are experiencing or who are at very high risk of homelessness. And then the American Rescue Plan included these last 2 columns, the emergency housing vouchers, which was $5 billion for 70,000 vouchers that are being planned for right now in communities. And then you have the homeless assistance dollars that really is primarily focused on capital investments, and eligible folks include people who are experiencing or at risk of homelessness, survivors of domestic violence, and veterans. So thinking about your prevention program across all 4 of these funding resources is really the way that we're suggesting that folks do their planning. Next slide, please. So now that you know what funding sources are available, what housing specific funding sources, and then what other sort of more broad funding sources are available to fill in holes, I think we next really think about what types of interventions we're talking about when we're talking about prevention. And I think about them with three main approaches. First is homelessness diversion, and that's really targeted to households who are presenting for homelessness assistance, but could be diverted from the streets or shelter with some assistance. And then the next is homelessness prevention. That population that's eligible for that are folks who are really at imminent risk of homelessness, folks who are doubled up, have prior histories of homelessness, and usually that is households that are at the extremely low income level, or 0 to 30% of area median income. They are the closest to actually becoming homeless without having presented to the system for shelter or other services. And then more broadly, you have eviction prevention, which is often targeted to households somewhere up to 50% of area median income and targeted to highly impacted neighborhoods. So you can see on this slide, the risk for housing loss and literal homelessness actually gets higher the further left you get in terms of these interventions. So that's really how we're thinking about interventions around prevention. Next slide, please. And then, so you have the money, and then you have the interventions. And now really you need to start thinking about targeting. And generally when we think about targeting, we think about it in three ways. The first is identifying communities or groups of folks that have been historically marginalized and impacted by those racist housing policies and disinvestment that Peggy alluded to. And then you want to target neighborhoods that are highly impacted. And if you go to the next slide, I just want to show you real quick. Last fall, a group of national organizations working together as the Framework for an Equitable COVID-19 Homelessness Response, that project, worked with the Urban Institute to develop a tool. I'll put all of these links in the chat when I'm done speaking. And this tool is incredibly helpful. It will actually show you at the neighborhood level what types of risk those neighborhoods are experiencing based on three sub-indices: housing instability, impact of COVID-19, and equity. So based on those three sub-indices, we break it down to the neighborhood or census tract level. And in this example that's on the left, this is the city of New Orleans. The darker the blue, the higher the risk. So communities can really target their prevention dollars to communities, to neighborhoods that have been hit hard by COVID-19 and who have histories of being impacted in other ways. Next slide, please. And then the third thing we want you to really think about is, we talked about thinking about groups of folks who have been historically marginalized, and then also thinking about how specific neighborhoods are impacted and targeting resources there. But then we also want to reach households who are at the greatest risk of experiencing homelessness or really deep housing instability. And that includes households, as I mentioned earlier, with current or prior histories of homelessness, who are at the lowest income levels, who might be staying in doubled up situations or other informal living arrangements, immigrants, and survivors of domestic violence. Next slide, please. So here are some of the links to the programs that Peggy and I both talked about. And as you're taking a look at this, I just want to note one last thing, and that's as you're listening to the rest of the speakers and thinking about how to design your own programs, I would really encourage you to think about partnering with people with lived expertise and asking them what they want and need out of these programs. I try to do that on a regular basis, and they are often the richest and most helpful conversations that I get to have in my work. You want to think about how you want to use your national data and your local data to create an equity-based design up front, and also to allow yourself to create mid-course corrections if you need to do that. And really, again, think about how you're conducting outreach to high need and historically marginalized communities in a variety of different ways. Again, I'm going to put some links in the chat when I'm done. And if you go to the next slide, this is the set of partners that work on the framework project. And the next slide. We'll be happy to take questions at the end of the presentation, and that's my email address. Back to you, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Anne. And I now have the honor to turn it over to Mary Beth Shin.
Well, thank you so much, Sharon. And thanks both to the Community Action Partnership and the National Alliance for including me today. I want to focus on getting prevention services to our poorest neighbors. Next slide, please. So COVID is currently an enormous challenge. More people are on shelter. There are unprecedented number of people who are potentially facing eviction, but it also provides incredible opportunities with kinds of resources that Anne and Peggy have been talking about. Next slide, please. So I think there are 4 challenges to successful prevention. I'm going to talk about 3 of them. Outreach, finding the people who are at risk, targeting the limited funds to people for whom they will make the most difference, finding the successful interventions to implement. And the last challenge that I won't talk about is how to braid all of those different funding streams that Anne talked about to be able to accomplish what you need. Next slide, please. So outreach, we can't just sit back and wait for people to call 211 or an eviction hotline. People who face eviction are not at such very high risk of homelessness. In a study in Chicago, people who called an eviction hotline when no help was available, only 2% became homeless after that, compared to 0.5% when help was available. So the money made a difference, but on a very low base. When we asked people who are literally homeless where they were before they became homeless, over half of them came from doubled up situations rather than from places that they owned or rented. So we're going to need to reach out to find those folks. They're not necessarily in our homeless service system or in our housing systems. Schools keep track of kids who are doubled up or who are staying in hotels. Schools are largely out right now. We also need to partner with Head Start. We need to focus on folks coming out of jail